Let's be real. What's a story worth telling if there's no one around to cause a little trouble? My name is Dan, and if you think a little chaos makes everything better, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Now, on with the show. The universe, with its infinite and sometimes just plain weird creativity, had dreamt up some truly spectacular stuff. It made pulsars that pulsed in cosmic rhythms, nebula that looked like a toddler's finger-painting masterpiece, and species that argued about the meaning of life through intricate, fragrant clouds. But somewhere along the line, after a couple of bad turns and a complete lack of imagination, it also coughed up the concordance of scale. And the concordance, in its infinite wisdom, gave the galaxy the curse of bland. And bland wasn't just a suggestion, it was the law. It was the color of the starship corridors, the jumpsuits, the nutrient paste, every official document, and you'd have to assume, the very souls of the bureaucrats in charge. It was the color of giving up. But Captain Stellan Boone's ship, the Spiteful Pelican, was a loud, colorful protest against the bland mandate. Her body was a chaotic quilt of scavenged metal, a plate of angry Martian rust from a derelict hauler, a square of obnoxious safety orange he'd swindled in a card game, and a gorgeous slice of sapphire that until just last week had been the door to a very high-end restroom. The vessel wasn't merely unattractive, it was a mobile masterpiece of bad decisions. In other words, it was an insult to eyeballs everywhere. "I'm telling you, Bess," Stellan declared, tipping his pilot's chair back until it groaned, releasing a small cloud of dust from a bygone era. "There's a galaxy-sized difference between a real coffee bean and this gloop." He swirled the brown gunk in his mug. It clung to the ceramic like a terrified barnacle. "This stuff doesn't get you going. It just bullies your taste buds into giving up." A crackle came from the console speaker. Bess's voice, a silky synthesized alto that carried the infinite patience of a preschool teacher, echoed in the cockpit. "The nutritional product labeled Sunrise Formula 12 provides all state-mandated daily vitamins and a government-approved dose of stimulants. Your so-called coffee beans are a primitive and clumsy method for delivering a single, unregulated chemical. It's called taste, Bess. A uniquely human obsession you wouldn't understand." Stellan took a swig as if to prove his point, grimaced, and slammed the mug onto the console. "It's the whole process, the sound of the grinder, the aroma. It's my own little act of defiance in a universe that wants us all slurping the same flavorless mush." "Your philosophical crisis has been logged under complaints subcategory uncaffeinated," Bess replied dryly. Stellan was about to argue when a polite, unassuming chime filled the cockpit, followed by a blinking amber light on his dashboard, a proximity warning. He shot a look at the main view screen. A ship was on an intercept course, and it moved with the kind of cold, robotic certainty that could only mean one thing: space cops. And it was, of course, painfully beige. It was a Concordance patrol ship, a model known unofficially as the Box. It was a triumph of utility over aesthetics, assuming its primary utility was to be as aggressively dull as physically possible. "Incoming transmission," Bess announced, "from Concordance vessel CSPS 919 identifier, the Admonisher." "The Admonisher?" Stellan groaned. "You're kidding me. Who names these things? They're not just police, they're a mobile HR department. He toggled the comms. Spiteful Pelican, go ahead. Everything okay, officers? A sterile, synthesized voice replied. This is Auditor Plenty of the Concordance of Scale. To the independent vessel designated Spiteful Pelican, you are in breach of multiple regulations. You will be boarded for a full audit and penalty assignment. Your compliance is mandatory. Stellan shot a look at Bess's monitor. What's the problem? Did I forget to signal a lane change 5 systems ago? Accessing public registries for your vessel's history, Bess said with a calculated pause. The list of your potential infractions is extensive. It could be the unauthorized thruster modification, the non-compliant inertial dampeners, or the artwork. Stellan glanced out the viewport. Right there, painted with a lot of heart and very little skill, was the ship's emblem. A cartoon pelican, grinning with unhinged fury, its beak overflowing with stolen nebula. Nah, they wouldn't sweat that. It's artistic expression. It is a Class C infraction under the Aesthetic Harmony Act of 784, Bess recited without a hint of emotion, which prohibits the unauthorized display of illustrations, murals, or unapproved color palettes on any ship hull. The box was now close enough to blot out a constellation, a docking claw extended with a pneumatic sigh, a lifeless gray arm reaching out to smother the pelican's vibrant personality. Right, Stellan sighed, combing his messy hair with his fingers. This is going to be a blast. The airlock hissed, and Auditor Plenty glided in. The being wasn't a person so much as a filing cabinet that had somehow learned to walk. Plenty was an ordinate, a species whose culture revolved entirely around protocols, procedures, and filling out forms in the correct order. Its body was an exoskeleton in regulation taupe, buffed to a depressing matte sheen. Its head rotated in short, sharp bursts, a trio of optical sensors in a perfect, unsettling triangle, absorbing every violation on the Pelican's cluttered bridge. One of its 4 limbs terminated in fine data jacks for interfacing with systems. Another ended in a pair of heavy-duty binders. It drifted silently across the deck and came to a halt in the center of the room. Its dispassionate sensors swept over a frayed wire, patched with electrical tape, the faint, illegal scent of roasted coffee, and the general lived-in chaos of a real home. Its 3 eyes focus it on Stellan. Captain Stellan Boone, Plenty began, its voice a perfect monotone, like an automated message from deep within its own chassis. I am Auditor Plenty, Compliance Officer, 4th Class, for the Concordance of Scale. As stated, I am here to document a significant number of infractions against Galactic Code. Stellan propped himself against a console, affecting an air of complete disinterest. Significant infractions? That sounds bad. I bet it was the coffee. A series of soft clicks emanated from Plenty's vocalizer. It raised an arm, projecting a small hologram into the space between them. A 3D model of the furious pelican appeared. First item, Plenty droned, Statute 416 of the Visual Consistency Mandate. All non-commercial vessels must be finished in an approved hue, ranging from mint to taupe. This, avian graffiti, is in direct violation. It gestured, and the image was replaced by a schematic of Stellan's engine. Second item, Statute 923 of the Sonic Tranquility Accord. Propulsion systems must operate within 9 decibels of ambient space. Your drive core produces a low-frequency vibration best described as jaunty. This is an act of acoustic rebellion." Stellan folded his arms. "Jaunty, let me tell you, that jaunty hum took me weeks to perfect. It's got personality." "Personality?" Plenty repeated the term as if it were a software bug. "That is not a recognized engineering principle." It gestured at the entire cockpit. "This whole ship is an affront to procedure. It is a monument to disorder, a carnival of noncompliance." It paused, drawing itself up to its maximum height for the grand pre-programmed finale. This wasn't just an audit. This was a crusade for conformity. The concordance of scale exists to bring predictable order to a chaotic galaxy, it announced, its volume increasing slightly but its tone remaining flat. "We have replaced the unpredictable noise of individual thought with the peaceful silence of sameness. We have traded the risks of personal choice for the security of a single, correct path. From the rotation of planets to the syntax of legal documents, every variable must conform. We have issued numerous warnings to Earth and its territories to adhere to galactic standards. Your ongoing defiance is not simply against the law, it is an insult to the very concept of civilization." Plenty went silent, letting the gravity of its pronouncement fill the room. It obviously expected Stellan to be intimidated, maybe even apologetic. But Stellan had listened to the entire monologue with a completely blank expression. He let the quiet linger for a moment, and then a slow, easy grin spread across his face. He let out a soft chuckle, a warm human sound that seemed to cause the auditor physical discomfort. Stellan tilted his head, speaking to Bess over his shoulder, but loud enough for Plenty to hear. "That's just precious," he said softly. He turned back to the seething ordinate, hooked a thumb in its direction, and said with a wide smile, "Wow, somebody really drank the corporate Kool-Aid." For the first time, Plenty's posture became rigid. A sharp, angry clicking came from its speaker. The Concordance had engineered mockery out of their society generations ago. Disrespect was a logical fallacy. The hologram winked out. The data jack arm retracted, and the arm with the binders lifted into a threatening position. "Contempt of a Concordance official," Plenty stated. Its voice was now a cold, level, and very final sound, stripped of all its earlier theatrics. "A Class A felony. Your vessel, the spiteful Pelican, is now forfeit. You are in custody." Stellan's smile finally dropped. "Hold on, you can't be serious." "Sarcasm," Auditor Plenty replied, its three eyes gleaming in the low light, "is the final refuge of the disorderly, and we have a regulation for that too." A tractor beam, as beige and as soulless as the ship it came from, latched onto the spiteful Pelican, shaking the little ship right down to its jaunty engine. Stellan could only stand and watch as his ship, his home, and the last shred of defiant color he owned was towed toward the bureaucratic black hole of the sector. It was a moon that had been hollowed out and rebuilt into a perfect beige sphere of absolute misery. The official name was the Grand Ledger, but everyone knew it as the place where dreams went to die in a long queue. But this perfectly ordered, soul-draining system made one critical error. They had no idea who they were messing with. So stick with me to find out how one defiant guy with a piece of paper is about to crash the most organized system in the galaxy. It wasn't so much a docking as a sterile click of metal on metal. The airlock sighed open to reveal a hallway and a pair of guards, polished in the same soul-crushing beige as everything else. With the clank of mechanical joints, they gestured for him to exit. Stellan threw one last glance at the grinning pelican painted on his ship's nose, then stepped onto the station. The guards immediately flanked him, their steps falling into a creepy, perfect rhythm. They marched him through an endless maze of identical corridors, all beige, marked with signs that had thrilling names like Adjudication Wing D and Clause Clarification Annex. The only sounds were the low hum of recycled air and the soft shuffling of feet from 1,000 other poor saps caught in the system. The whole place smelled of filtered oxygen and quiet desperation. They walked past lines of beings from 100 different worlds, all wearing the same expression of complete surrender, as they waited for a number, a stamp, or a final judgment. This wasn't a jail, it was something far worse. It was cosmic jury duty. The guards finally escorted Stellan into a small, empty room where a silver orb with a single glowing blue eye floated over to him. Subject: Stellan Boone, human. The drone's voice was so flat and monotone it could make a party sound like a eulogy. Charge: contempt of concordance. Vessel, the spiteful pelican, has been impounded. Do you understand these terms? Loud and clear, Sparky, Stellan grumbled. But what about my co-pilot, Bess? The drone's blue eye pulsed once. Designation: Bess, Shipboard Artificial Intelligence. Upon review, the unit was found to have committed 1,472 minor infractions. As per protocol, AOSS with non-critical violations are subject to immediate processing. The AI core has been wiped. Those words hit Stellan like a punch to the gut. Sure, he and Bess bickered constantly, but she was the sarcastic, nagging heart of his ship. She was his family, and just like that, they had deleted her. The cockpit of his mind suddenly felt vast and empty. He was completely alone. Immediate processing, he echoed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. That's very efficient of you. The concordance prioritizes efficiency, the drone buzzed. You will now be held in the primary detainee waiting area. Please follow the illuminated pathway. A faint beige line lit up on the floor, leading him back out into the labyrinth. With the two beige guards shadowing him like ghosts, Stellan followed the glowing line. He'd gone from being a starship captain to just another number in a colossal, grinding machine. The little spark of defiance he'd felt earlier was being smothered under a heavy blanket of boredom, now laced with the sharp sting of losing Bess. And in a place like this, boredom was the most flammable substance you could find. The waiting hall was an architectural tribute to the phrase, "We couldn't care less." It was a cavernous space so massive you couldn't see the far wall, illuminated by sterile white ceiling panels that shed a light with absolutely no warmth. Hundreds of beings sat motionless on endless rows of backless beige benches. The guards deposited Stellan on a vacant spot and marched away in perfect sync, leaving him in the suffocating silence. He just sat there for a bit, soaking in the collective misery. A small, amphibious creature nearby with enormous sad eyes kept inflating its throat pouch in a long drawn-out sigh. A being that looked like a tall tree stood close by, its leaves withered and gray, as if it had been rooted to that spot for a century. A few benches over, he spotted a creature that resembled a giant, brightly colored sea slug, a swirl of purple and orange, Its shell was almost entirely plastered with sticky penalty citations. This being, a gastrin, was intently reading something on a data pad, its long eye stalks tracing the text. Every few seconds, it would let out a low, gurgling sound of pure despair. For Stellan, grief and anger were rapidly curdling into a deep, dangerous boredom. He had to do something. He needed to know what was going on, so he got to his feet. The simple act of standing up caused a few heads to turn. In the far corner, he saw a kiosk marked with the universal symbol for information, which was, naturally, a beige circle inside of a beige square. As he approached, a screen flickered to life. "Welcome. To check the status of your case, please insert Form 883C. Stellan just stared at it. Form 883C, and where am I supposed to get one of those? The kiosk replied instantly, Form 883C is issued upon the successful completion of Form 21B, the initial detainment declaration. Right, Stellan sighed. And where do I find a 21B? Form 21B can be obtained by filing Form 104G, the Administrative Documentation Request. A muscle in Stellan's jaw started to twitch. It was a perfect, inescapable loop of red tape. But then a foggy memory surfaced from a painfully dull lecture he'd slept through during pilot training. He leaned in close to the kiosk's audio pickup. I would like to invoke Bylaw 789, subsection Epsilon, the right to tangible record. I am making a formal request for a physical paper copy of Form 104G. The terminal went completely silent. The text on the screen vanished. A low whirring noise started up, climbing higher and higher in pitch like the machine was in agony. Physical paper? On a moon that was the very definition of digital bureaucracy, the concept was practically prehistoric. The station's one and only printer was a monstrous machine that hadn't been powered on in centuries, buried somewhere in a long-forgotten sub-basement. The kiosk's light blinked erratically. The whining sound became a piercing screech, and then, with a pathetic little pop, the screen went black. Stellan turned around, a slow, deeply satisfied grin spreading across his face. Across the hall, the gastrine with the ticket-covered shell was staring at him, its eye stalks wide with utter disbelief and, maybe, just a hint of admiration. The system couldn't refuse the request. That bylaw was embedded in its core programming from an era before digital files, a rule so ancient and obscure that everyone had forgotten it was even there. The request shot through the station's network like a computer virus. Digital departments instantly rejected it. The archives division couldn't locate a template. The logistics team had no idea how to dispatch a physical object. Finally, the request ended up with the station's maintenance AI, a far more practical program that cross-referenced an ancient hardware inventory. Deep in the digital heart of the Grand Ledger, panicked error messages began to flash. After sifting through dusty digital archives, the maintenance AI found it. Printing press, Industrial Model 3, Sector Hilliard, Sublevel 9. A system-wide Priority 1 alert, the kind normally reserved for a full-blown reactor breach, flashed across the entire moon. The AI immediately pulled 4 maintenance drones from their floor-buffing duties and assigned them a bizarre new task: locate and reactivate the ancient printing press. Miles above, In her flawlessly beige, perfectly round office, Senior Proctor Magestra noticed the alert appear on her monitor, and for the first time in over a decade, she actually frowned. She was in a completely different class than Plenty, a picture-perfect example of the ordinate species. Her body was sleeker, her motions more fluid, and an intimidating, polished crest rose from the back of her head. Her beige armor wasn't just clean. It was lacquered to a shine, giving it the deep luster of fine china. A tiny yellow flag had just blinked to life on her sector-wide efficiency report. It was flagging a Level 3 procedural jam originating from the detainee processing sector. It was nothing. Probably just a sensor needing a reset or a minor logic hiccup in one of the kiosks. She made a mental note to run a diagnostic, her long, graceful fingers gliding over the holographic display. In her mind, the station was a perfectly tuned instrument, an equation where order went in one side and harmony came out the other. Stellan Boone's ridiculous request was just a tiny misplaced variable that she casually swiped away. She had far more important things to calculate. Far below, in the archives, the maintenance drones had found their target. Sector Heliad was a place forgotten by time, choked with the dust of ages. The air was cold and dead. There, in the center of a vast abandoned chamber, sat the printing press. It was a beast of a machine, a sleeping giant of gears, levers, and ink reservoirs, all fused together by rust and neglect. The drones, designed for polishing floors and tweaking sensors, simply stared at the mechanical monster, their simple logic circuits struggling to comprehend. Their directive was simple: reactivate. So they began their work. Their small, delicate arms scraped uselessly at rust-sealed panels and tried to chip away ink that had hardened into stone. The whole operation was clumsy and agonizingly slow, and it unleashed a tidal wave of new maintenance requests for industrial lubricants, rust solvents, and a user manual that had been digitally archived 500 years ago. The entire maintenance division was now grinding to a halt, all because a single human had stubbornly decided to use an ancient rule. Back in the waiting hall, Stellan was leaning back on his bench with his hands laced behind his head, a genuine smile on his face for the first time in days. He had just tossed a wrench into the machine. It might have been a small wrench, but in his mind, he could almost hear the gears starting to grind. A little while later, though time had a thick syrupy quality in the waiting hall, a hesitant, shuffling figure appeared next to him. It was the gastropoid. He stood with his shell angled toward Stellan, as if trying to hide from his own courage. His delicate antennae were twitching nervously, and he kept his eye stalks pointed at the floor. Pardon me," the gastropoid whispered, his voice a low, watery gurgle. "My designation is Glick." Stellan replied without moving a muscle. "What's on your mind, Glick?" "I saw what you did," Glick said, his voice a quiet hum beneath the drone of the air recyclers. "Over at the information kiosk." His voice sank to a hush. You actually broke it." The machine was having a meltdown. Glick, the alien who looked like a giant snail, edged closer. "They've held me here for 3 trips around this system's sun," he whispered, his eye stalks rising to look me right in the eye. They were huge and shimmered with a sad, wet light. It was because of a comma on a shipping form. Form 72 Alpha for perishable goods. They claimed my comma was grammatically confusing. I've sent in 412 appeals. Every single one was denied for improper formatting. I sat up straight, turning to face him, and saw the layers of penalty stickers covering his shell. They were like a scrapbook of his misery, proof of 3 years spent being slowly crushed by paperwork. A comma, I repeated, my voice completely deadpan. They argued it could be mistaken for a semicolon if you tilted your head just right, Glick explained, his antennae twitching at the memory of the sheer unfairness of it all. I tried to explain, but they quoted Regulation 201.4. Clerical errors can be considered a form of procedural sabotage. I just stared. This wasn't just ridiculous. It was genuinely cruel. A hot spark of anger ignited inside me. You seem to get the rules, Glick said, waving a fleshy hand toward the now dead kiosk. The old ones, anyway. I was hoping maybe you could help me. An idea began to spark in my mind, a wild, brilliant, and deeply satisfying idea. I could do more than just mess things up for them. I could teach the other prisoners how to burn the whole system down. Help you, I said, a slow, wicked grin spreading across my face. Oh, I think we can do much better than that, my friend. Ever heard of filing a complaint for deliberate complication of bureaucratic standards? Glick's eye stalks shot up. But that's a level 9 complaint. It needs you to cite 3 different legal codes and get a witnessed statement of your intentions. Exactly, I said, patting his clammy shoulder. And we're going to write them a masterpiece. We're going to drown them in their own red tape. And just like that, we were huddled together, plotting over his data pad. All of Glick's nervous energy suddenly found a new direction. The very fear that had paralyzed him for years had forced him to memorize every rule and regulation, turning him into a walking, talking law library. He could recite obscure statutes from memory. He was our secret weapon. I was the strategist, the one who could look at a rule and figure out how to twist it into a knife. Look at this, Glick said, his voice a little stronger now as he pointed a shaky finger at the screen. Statute 33B says all complaints have to be reviewed by the officer who first filed the charge. But Statute 501C says that same officer can't oversee a case if they're named in the complaint. It's a direct contradiction. It's not just a contradiction, I corrected him with a grin. It's a tripwire. We file the complaint and name your original caseworker. The system automatically sends it to his desk. Then we file a second motion demanding he be removed from the case, citing 501C. The system will get stuck trying to reassign it, but since he's the only one in his department, the whole thing will have to get kicked upstairs, creating a massive bottleneck. It's a paper jam, Glick, and we just learned how to start one. As we worked, our quiet conversation was a bizarre mix of legal jargon and whispered rebellion. I saw Glick's whole posture change. His antennae stopped trembling. His eyes held a new, steady fire. Then he mentioned something casually, a story he'd heard from another long hauler. They say, it's just a story, of course. But they say the entire digital law code is based on one single physical book, he whispered like he was sharing a huge secret. The first codex, written by the founders before everything went digital. They say all the real fundamental laws are in that book, the kind of laws they don't want you to remember. I tucked that little tidbit away in the back of my mind. A physical book. The ultimate paper trail. The idea clicked with my small victory over the kiosk. It was another piece of the puzzle. But for now, we had work to do. Glick and I were a team, and we were about to go to war. The ripple effect from Glick's complaint started as a tiny freeze in a remote corner of the galactic bureaucracy, but it began to spread. Glick's caseworker, a perpetually frazzled drone named Clerk 44G, found his terminal locked in an inescapable loop. The complaint was stuck, impossible to process, but also impossible to delete. His screen flooded with error codes, his work ground to a halt. For the first time in his career, he had to file a form he had only heard rumors about. Form 99X, a request for procedural arbitration. It would take months to sort out. For the first time in 3 years, Glick wasn't in danger. His case was frozen, trapped by the same system that had tried to destroy him. Word of this small, impossible victory zipped through the waiting hall in hushed tones. The giant frog creature's sad sighs grew farther apart. The dusty air seemed to glow with a tiny new spark of something. It was hope, and it was spreading. I became a sort of folk hero. Stellan, the human who broke the machine, the guy who weaponized a comma. Other detainees would eye me from across the room with a mix of awe and fear. Then, one day, a new player entered the game. She'd been there all along, a permanent fixture in the hall, but so perfectly still that she'd faded into the background. She was a knotwood, a walking, sentient tree named Brickia. Her body was a powerful, slow-moving collection of woody limbs like an ancient oak that had decided to take a walk. A glowing green lichen grew in the cracks of her bark, feeding on the station's background radiation. Every step she took was slow and deliberate. She stopped directly in front of Glick and me, casting a long shadow over us. Glick flinched and retreated into his shell, but I just looked up. Her face was a cluster of smooth, hard knots, and her gaze was sharp as an arrowhead. When she spoke, her voice was the deep, resonant creak of ancient wood. "You," she rumbled. It wasn't a question. "Me?" I replied. "I was detained," she stated, the words sounding like they were being pulled from the center of the earth. 18 solar cycles ago. The charge. Unauthorized botanical activity in a designated zone of aesthetic harmony. I was photosynthesizing. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "You were being a plant in a place they wanted to look pretty." "Precisely," Brickia confirmed. "I am a knotwood. It is what I do. They informed me my bark texture was visually disruptive." Glick poked his head out of his shell. "That's a direct violation of the Indigenous Forms Act," he squeaked. "A species can't be penalized for its natural biological functions." Brickia's inner light seemed to glow just a little brighter. "I have practiced patience," she said. So that was our team. A guy arrested for bad grammar. A tree arrested for being a tree. And me, Stellan, watching this odd couple, a bundle of nerves and a living statue, become my best shot at freedom. I had to smile. This was going to be fun. "Welcome aboard," I said. This was the birth of our rebellion, but first we needed a base of operations, somewhere the station's security cameras couldn't see us. And Glick, Our walking map of the station knew the perfect spot. "Sanitation Hub 4J," he whispered, pulling up a schematic. It turned out there was a tiny scheduling conflict between the cleaning bots and the security network. The glitch created a 71.5-hour blind spot that repeated every cycle, a window where all surveillance logs were mysteriously wiped. A tiny computer argument had created the perfect hideout. It was a flaw in a system obsessed with being flawless, and we made it our home. The place smelled like antiseptic and ozone, all sterile metal and cleaning fluids. It was a small, circular room, really just a glorified closet for janitor bots. It was cramped and ugly. But to us, it was a castle. And inside our little beige fortress, we finally started to talk. Glick told us his story of a 3-year war against a punctuation algorithm, and it came out sounding like an epic saga. Brikia, in her slow, rumbling voice, explained that her 18-cycle detention was less than a blink of an eye for her species, who measure time in the slow crawl of glaciers. To her, the frantic, pointless hustle of this place was an insult to her very existence. Then it was my turn. I told them about a stubborn space pelican, a woman named Bess, and a life spent running from the exact kind of soul-crushing rules that had trapped me here. I talked about the petty tyrants and pointless regulations that try to fence in the wide-open sky, and how I'd ended up right in the heart of it all. Have you ever been so wronged by the system that you wanted to scream? I have. I once had a partner, I told them, the confession feeling too big for the tiny closet we called a hideout. We had our own ship. We followed every rule, filed every permit, paid every outrageous tax. We were trying to build a small, honest delivery service. But then the Concordance, this soul-crushing bureaucratic empire, annexed our sector. Overnight, our ship's engine was deemed obsolete. They gave us an impossible choice: scrap the ship we poured our lives into, or pay for an upgrade that cost more than a small moon. Just like that, our dream was gone. Glick's eye stalks sagged in sympathy. Brikia's crystal body glowed a soft, soothing green. And in that moment, with their silent support, a laugh bubbled up out of me. Then they started laughing too. It was the pure, beautiful sound of friendship bouncing off the walls of our little sanctuary. And right there, in a glorified broom closet, we decided to go to war. But our war wouldn't be fought with blasters. It would be fought with paperwork. Glick was our general. He'd spend his days diving into legal codes, hunting for contradictions. Then he'd unleash a tidal wave of clarification requests on the administration. He'd send messages like, "Per Statute 45A, all official correspondence must be in Standard Kent." However, Amendment 212C mandates that documents for non-native species be provided in their primary language. As a gas drain, I respectfully request all 4,782 pages of the legal code be translated into moist gurgle. I'll be waiting. That one request alone caused the station's ancient translation software to have a complete and total meltdown. Brikia was our secret weapon, a master of what she called passive obstruction. She took Glick's legal discoveries and turned them into a kind of performance art. She would simply stop in the middle of a crowded corridor, bringing all traffic to a halt. When security arrived, she would calmly say, "I'm sensing a subtle yet troubling vibration in the floor plating." In her slow, gravelly voice, she'd add, "My species is exceptionally sensitive to seismic irregularities. The Structural Integrity Act requires you to shut down this entire sector for a mandatory inspection. Entire zones of the station would close for days while maintenance drones performed utterly pointless scans. Her true masterpiece, though, was when she planted herself directly in front of the station commander's favorite nutrient paste dispenser, right at the lunch rush. She claimed its low hum was interfering with her meditative state, a right protected under some forgotten spiritual freedom clause. Thousands of workers missed their midday serving of bland beige goop. The disruption to their routine was so severe it nearly sparked a riot. My job was to be the conductor of this beautiful orchestra of chaos. I took their tactics and started spreading the gospel of malicious compliance. I showed a massive creature with 16 legs how to file 16 separate footwear allowance forms for his 16 individual boots. A species of bird people whose language was song began submitting their legal appeals as hours-long, screeching space operas, forcing terrified clerks to transcribe every single note. Before long, the main detainee hall, once a place of silent misery, was buzzing with the rustle of data pads and hushed, excited planning. The very air crackled with the energy of creative rebellion. I hadn't just jammed a wrench in the gears of the machine. I had handed a wrench to everyone else and showed them where to stick it. Miles away, in her sterile, silent office, Senior Proctor Magistra watched her perfectly balanced system begin to fracture. The yellow warning icons on her monitor bloomed from a few dozen to hundreds. Red alerts, flagging catastrophic drops in efficiency, popped up across her sector map like a nasty rash. The clean, predictable river of data that was her lifeblood was now a sluggish, filthy swamp choked by a million tiny, infuriating acts of defiance. The processing of new detainees had slowed to a crawl. The station's maintenance department was now facing a backlog that stretched for the next 3 years. And the cafeteria was getting complaints that people were, for the first time in history, actively disliking the nutrient paste, a food engineered specifically to be completely tasteless and unmemorable. This wasn't a glitch in the system. This was an attack. This was personal. Magistra's fingers danced across her console, her movements sharp with a cold fury. She traced the threads of chaos back to their origins. A ridiculous printer request, a complaint from a gastrine named Glick, an endless stream of structural reports from a crystalline entity named HFY. And at the heart of it all, spreading like a virus, was the one variable she couldn't control. The human, Stellan Boone. Security feeds from the waiting area showed me holding quiet conversations, showing people things on their data pads, and the unmistakable spark of hope appearing in their eyes. I was a contamination, a disease of hope that threatened to bring her perfectly ordered world crashing down. She sat up straight, her polished chrome arm gleaming in the cold glow of her screens. Order would be restored. An example would be made. She issued 2 commands. The first went out system-wide. Activate Protocol Z and 9. All detainee data pads are now restricted to read-only access. The second was just for me. Schedule an immediate tribunal for Boone Stellan. The charge: contempt of the concordance. The system was about to do what it did best, crush the problem under its own weight. The news of my tribunal landed like a physical blow in our little closet. We were all gathered when Glick, who had been monitoring the court dockets, let out a choked, terrified gurgle. They've scheduled you for the top of the list," he stammered, his eye stalks trembling. "Your hearing is next shift. She's going to make an example of you." He tapped uselessly at his datapad. "It's worse than that. She's locked us out. Our datapads are read only. I can't file motions. I can't search precedents. I can't even get to my own files." That old cold knot of fear tightened in my gut. I knew I was poking a very large, very angry bear. Well, the bear was finally poking back, and its claws were out. The giddy, triumphant feeling from the past few days evaporated, leaving a thick, heavy silence. "She's patching the holes as fast as we find them," I said, my voice hollow. Brikia, who had been standing as still as a statue in the corner, rumbled, "Then we must find a loophole written in a law that is much deeper." And it was Glick who found it. With all his digital resources gone, he was forced to rely on the one database Magistra couldn't lock, his own mind. He squeezed his eyes shut, his antennae twitching, as he mentally sifted through 3 years of obsessive, paranoid research. He went past the current statutes, digging deeper into the station's founding history, into the original shipping manifests from its construction. And that's when he saw it. A single item logged on an inventory list for the main tribunal chamber. Item 1. Description: Foundational Codex, leather-bound manual. Glick gasped. He went completely still, his eyes wide and unfocused. "It's real," he breathed. "What's real?" I asked. "The first codex," Glick whispered, his voice shaking with a manic, disbelieving joy. "The old myth all the long-term detainees tell stories about. It's not a myth. It's here." It was on the original cargo manifest. It was a physical book. The three of us just stood there, stunned. It was a legend, a fairy tale. The idea that the station's true original laws were written down in a real book somewhere. If that book was real, it could change everything. "Okay," I said, my brain kicking back into gear. The despair vanished, replaced by the electric thrill of a truly terrible idea beginning to form. "So we have a book, and we have a tribunal. That means we need 2 things, a massive distraction and a way to get our hands on that book." I looked at Glick. From memory, where would they store an old physical artifact? "The deep archives," Glick said without hesitation. "Sector Caligula. It's a zero-atmosphere, cold storage vault, fully automated. The entrance is behind a Class 10 blast door." "A door is just a door," I grinned. "Now tell me everything you know about its maintenance schedule." "Brikia, you're on the door. I'll create the distraction." I looked at my crew. Glick, the anxious little snail who had become a legal mastermind, and Brikia, the quiet rock person who could stop an army by simply standing still. A wave of fierce loyalty washed over me. This was for them. "All right," I smirked. "Let's go steal a law book." It was an insane, reckless plan with a million ways it could fail, which was exactly my kind of plan. First on the list, the distraction. I strolled over to the food dispensary, which was now staffed by a very twitchy clerk still recovering from the last nutrient paste scandal. I slapped my ID slate down on the counter, fully aware that it was flagged as read-only. "I need to file a formal request for a complete morphological review of the ration paste," I announced, my voice booming through the quiet hall. The clerk's insect-like mandibles clicked with bewilderment. Uh, uh, what, sir? A morphological review, I repeated slowly, as if talking to a child. In accordance with the Galactic Health and Sustenance Act, Section 4, Paragraph 2, I have reason to believe this paste, designated Morning Vigor 12, does not meet the required viscosity and textural standards for its classification. To put it simply, it's just not beige enough. I am demanding a full spectral analysis and a mouthfeel audit. The clerk just gawked, completely paralyzed. The complaint was so absurdly specific there was nothing in his procedural manual to cover it. He frantically typed into his terminal, firing off a desperate plea for guidance up the chain of command. That message appeared on the screen of some mid-level manager, already drowning in paperwork, who just to make the notification go away, approved it without even reading it. The result was instantaneous and glorious. The entire cafeteria was immediately declared a potential biohazard. Alarms screamed, heavy blast doors slammed shut, and hazmat drones descended from the ceiling, wrapping everything in quarantine tape and confiscating every last tube of ration paste for analysis. My one single complaint plunged the tightly managed feeding schedule for tens of thousands of people into absolute beautiful chaos. It was the single greatest disruption in the station's recorded history. With the station's security completely tied up dealing with the great paste apocalypse of Shift 97, our three heroes saw their chance. They ducked into the maintenance shafts where Glick, a lanky insectoid, guided them through a tangle of pipes and service tunnels he knew like the back of his own hand. Before long, they were standing in front of a colossal circular vault door marked Deep Archive, Caligula 9. The air was bone-chillingly thin and cold. The original blueprints showed a tiny mistake in the housing for the locking mechanism, Glick whispered, pointing a spindly finger high up on the massive door. Just a small error during construction. That one spot is 0.8% weaker than it should be. Brea, a being who looked like a walking tree, stepped forward. She placed her thick, bark-covered hands right where Glick had pointed. She set her feet, and the symbiotic lichen woven into her skin started to hum with a soft green light. The glow pulsed, growing brighter as she focused all her stored energy into a slow, unstoppable push. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the immense, silent pressure. Then, the vault door's metal began to groan, a deep, vibrating protest that shook the floor beneath them. A single, spiderweb-thin crack appeared in the wall around the lock, and then, with a sickening crunch, an entire chunk of the reinforced wall just buckled. The locking pins shot out of their wrecked sockets like bullets, and the giant door swung inward with a defeated hiss, breathing out a cloud of frigid, ancient air. Inside, colossal shelves packed with forgotten paper files stretched up into the crushing darkness. A spider-like drone with several glowing red eyes glided along a track on the ceiling, its beam sweeping over the silent aisles. "It follows a random pattern," Glick whispered, "but its optical sensors only refresh every single second. If you can block its line of sight for that one split second it looks your way, it won't even register you're there." It was a nerve-wracking game of timing and guts. Glick called out the drone's movements, his anxious voice a strange, steady beat in the silence. Stellan and Glick scrambled from shelf to shelf while the slow-moving Brea would step out into the open at the absolute perfect moment. Her wide, tree-like frame was just big enough to shield them from the drone's sensors for the fraction of a second they needed to cross. At last, they reached the central chamber. There, resting on a pedestal, was a single object, a massive leather-bound book, its cover ancient and cracked. The first codex. But just as Stellan reached for it, a piercing alarm blared through the archive. They'd been caught. "No time!" Stellan hissed, grabbing the book. It was shockingly heavy. "Glick, find something, anything!" Glick's eye stalks blurred as they scanned the index pages with lightning speed. As the doors on the far side of the room slid open, a squad of enforcer drones marched in, their pincer-like arms raised and ready to fire. His fingers flew through the ancient, brittle pages. "Looking for something special?" Stellan quipped, bracing himself for capture. "A right of Foundation review," Glick breathed, his voice full of wonder. It was a dusty legal theory he'd only ever read about in old textbooks. "I never thought it was real." His finger landed on a line just as the drones cornered them. His whole body went still. He looked up, his huge eyes gleaming with discovery. He'd found it. Article 1, Subsection 1, Glick whispered, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated joy. "It's a law that says any citizen can halt all legal proceedings to demand a complete manual audit of the entire system to make sure it still follows the original physical codex." Stellan just stared at him. Then he started to chuckle, a low laugh that grew into a booming echo that filled the dusty archive, even as the drones closed in. It was the most beautiful, elegantly nerdy bombshell he had ever seen. The tribunal chamber was designed to make you feel like an ant. It was a vast, cold arena, and Stellan was standing all alone on a small platform in the center. Way up high, Senior Proctor Magistra sat on a throne that looked more like a mountain. Her polished beige armor seemed to drink the light, and her face was a mask of cold certainty. She was the system itself, in physical form. Guards flanked Stellan, silent reminders of his fate. And near the throne, Auditor Plenty stood there, practically vibrating with smug triumph. Magistra's voice, amplified and utterly devoid of emotion, echoed through the chamber. It was the sound of perfect, unfeeling logic. "Stellan Boone," she said, gesturing to the heavy leather book on the evidence table. "You stand accused of contempt and the theft of restricted archives. You are a virus in our perfectly ordered society. You have mocked our laws, inspired defiance, and created unacceptable levels of inefficiency. You are a random variable in a perfect equation. You are noise." "And noise," she declared, letting the words hang in the air, "must be silenced. This tribunal finds you guilty. Your sentence is to be permanently locked away in the Oblivion Ward, where your chaotic influence will finally be erased." She raised her gavel, a heavy block of black stone that screamed finality. But just as it began to fall, Stellan looked up at her, a confident smirk spreading across his face. "I don't think so," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "In accordance with my rights as a citizen under concordance law," Stellan announced, his voice now ringing with newfound power, "I hereby invoke Article 1, Subsection 1 of the Foundational Codex. I demand a full and immediate stop to these proceedings, and I formally request a manual audit of the entire Concordance legal system to ensure it aligns with this original text. A collective gasp swept through the room. Plenty's speaker let out a sharp, static-filled squeal of shock. Magistra stared at the projected image of the ancient text, her perfect composure finally showing a crack. Her eyes flicked from the book to the smirking human. She knew that law. It was an ancient, forgotten failsafe from when the system was first created, buried under centuries of digital updates. It was never, ever meant to be used, but it was there. And it was the law, her law. She turned to her console. For the first time, her elegant fingers trembled just slightly. She typed a command, searching for some kind of loophole, any override. The station's central AI, the logical brain of the whole system, processed her request. A calm, synthetic voice echoed through the chamber as one message flashed on Magistra's console and every other screen on the station. Command accepted. Article 1, Subsection 1, Foundational Directive, Initiating Protocol Omega Legal Stasis. All judicial and enforcement functions hereby suspended pending manual audit. All sentences stayed. All detainment orders under indefinite review. Compliance is mandatory. In that single instant, the legal justification for every single prisoner on the station, all based on a digital code now overruled by its physical master, had completely ceased to exist. Red emergency alerts flashed across the station, broadcasting the new absolute command. Magistra stared at Stellan with the wide-eyed horror of a high priestess whose own sacred text had just declared her a heretic. For the very first time, her flawless mask shattered. The one thing she worshipped, the absolute letter of the law, had just been turned against her to bring down her entire world. It was a power far greater than any weapon. The news ripped through the station like an earthquake. The constant, oppressive drone of bureaucracy simply stopped, replaced by the calm, steady pulse of the legal stasis protocol. The guard drones, their authority instantly erased, froze dead in their tracks. Have you ever been so tangled up in red tape you felt like you'd never escape? That was everyday life for countless beings, right up until the moment the entire system just stopped. The beige robot bureaucrats slumped forward in their chairs, their little lights blinking out. Every terminal, which seconds before had displayed an endless scroll of case numbers and wait times, now glowed with the most glorious message anyone had ever seen. All proceedings suspended. For a moment there was dead silence. Then, a tiny little frog-like creature let out a hopeful chirp. Another one joined in, and suddenly the whole hall erupted, the air filled with the clicks, whistles, roars, and cheers of 100 different species getting their first taste of freedom in years. A slow, joyful, chaotic parade began as former detainees streamed out of the hall, heading straight for the ship impound lot. The guards couldn't do a thing. They just stood there, frozen by the shutdown. Their power had vanished in a flash. If you've ever cheered for the little guy, you're gonna love this. From her high-tech observation deck, Senior Proctor Magistra, a woman who lived by the very rules she created, could only watch in utter horror as her perfect, orderly world came crashing down in a beautiful, chaotic mess. Down below, Stellan walked out of the tribunal a free man. His friends, Glick and Brea, were waiting for him. Glick was practically vibrating with joy, his serrata tentacles waving excitedly in the air. Brea's internal light, which showed her emotions, was glowing a brilliant, triumphant emerald green. The three of them headed to the impound bay where their ship, the spiteful Pelican, was waiting. The ship looked wonderfully ugly and out of place, a splash of real personality in the sterile beige hangar. As Stellan began the pre-flight check, his friends came up the boarding ramp. Glick was holding out a data slate. "Your departure papers," Glick announced, his voice practically buzzing with a newfound pride. "Authenticated with all the proper digital signatures. You see, when the whole legal system froze, the security firewalls crashed right along with it. I took the liberty of approving them myself while everything was rebooting." Just then, Brea stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She held a heavy, strangely shaped piece of petrified wood. It was a new hull plate, grown from a piece of her own body, from her very essence. Carved deep into its surface was a grinning, furious pelican. It was somehow louder, more beautifully ugly, and far more magnificent than the old one he'd painted on himself. "A non-regulation hull plate," she rumbled in her deep, earthy voice. "Visually disruptive." Stellan took it from her, feeling the wood, impossibly warm, in his hands. He looked over at his friends, the gentle, rule-obsessed Glick and the stoic, tree-like Brea. He'd drifted to this station totally alone, just a bitter cargo hauler so bored he was looking for trouble. Now he was leaving with the family. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you, so what's next for you two?" Glick's eye stalks drooped just a little, a clear sign he was sad to see him go. "Well," Stellan said, a sly wink in his eye, "I hear this station is going to need a brand new legal system. Sounds like a job for a detail-oriented guy who knows all the rules, and maybe someone strong and silent to keep him honest." Glick's entire body seemed to light up with excitement, and Brea let out a low, humming sound of pure approval. Stellan took the new hull plate and mounted it on the cockpit wall, right beside his pilot's seat, where he could always see its reflection shimmering on the console. He sank into the pilot's chair, the worn-out cushions feeling more like home than anything had in years. For just a second, his eyes fell on the empty co-pilot seat, and the sharp pain of losing his old partner Bess hit him like a physical blow. But then, as he looked at the incredible gift from his new friends, a wave of warmth washed the sadness away. He fired up the engines. The ship came to life with a cheerful, non-compliant hum, the perfect sound of happy rebellion. He gave his friends one last wave through the viewport and sealed the ramp. The spiteful pelican lifted off the deck, its mismatched colors a brilliant protest against the endless, soul-crushing beige of the station. Stellan steered his ship out of the hangar and into the deep black of space. He pushed the throttle forward, and the engines roar, a clear violation of the station's auditory serenity pact, echoed like a victory cry through the system. He glanced at the empty co-pilot's seat one more time, then at the reflection of the new wooden pelican on the control panel. The corners of his mouth, usually pulled down into a sarcastic smirk, lifted into a quiet, genuine smile. He engaged the warp drive, and the spiteful pelican shot forward, streaking across the stars like a comet, leaving a trail of beautiful, liberating, and wonderfully uncivilized disruption in its wake. And what's the lesson here? Sometimes the very best things in life can only begin right after the old broken rules finally fall apart.